Welcome, I'm Konrad Grzelewski for Polish Politics, your source of up-to-date information on politics in Poland. We are only minutes away from the beginning of the quiet period before the second round of the presidential elections in Poland in 2020. Now, who will win this election? Who will become the next Polish president? What were the results of the first round, and what can we infer about who has the highest chances of winning the second round? Lastly, what will happen to Szymon Hołownia and his movement? How will this continue? How will this shape the future of the political landscape in Poland? Let's first look at the election results. Now, as you can see, Andrzej Duda won the first round of the presidential elections with 43.5% of the popular vote. Rafał Trzaskowski, the representative of the Civic Platform, came in second with 30.46% of the vote. Then Szymon Hołownia, who has won a very respectable 13.87% of the vote. Then Krzysztof Bosak, representing the far right, with 6.78%. And considerably further behind, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz from the Farmers' Party with 2.46%, and Robert Biedroń from the left with 2.22%. This is quite a bad result because it's worse than the presidential candidate representing the left in 2015, which back then was considered to be a historically low result. Now, looking at the numbers, including numbers of individual votes that those candidates have received, there were two questions that weren't that popular in the media, which actually were very interesting to me personally. First of all, what would have happened if some of the candidates would not have run and their voters stayed at home? Would Andrzej Duda would he have won in the first round? And if you calculate the difference between this 43.5% and the 50% threshold, and take into account that this difference would of course be dependent on how many people actually turn up for the election, I calculated that Duda would need about 2.8 million, over 2.8 million votes more in order to win in the first round. So he was clearly far away from that. Even, for instance, if all of the Szymon Hołownia voters would have stayed at home, Andrzej Duda would have still arrived below the 50% benchmark. In fact, hypothetically, he would have needed certainly all the Szymon Hołownia supporters to stay at home, and possibly, for instance, some of the Robert Biedroń supporters to stay at home. Right? Then it would be possible. From a different perspective, let's imagine that everybody stays home apart from Andrzej Duda, Rafał Trzaskowski, and Szymon Hołownia supporters. In that case, it would still not be enough. Andrzej Duda would have barely missed the 50% threshold if there were only those three candidates. Another question that me as a Szymon Hołownia supporter asked myself, that I asked myself was, okay, what was the share of Rafał Trzaskowski voters that we would need to overturn or convince to vote for Szymon Hołownia in order for Szymon Hołownia to be actually number two? Because at first glance it seems to be a rather big number. However, if you look closer at the numbers, it's literally 1.611972 million voters. So 1,611,972 voters from the group, from the cohort that voted for Rafał Trzaskowski. They had to vote for Szymon Hołownia in order for Szymon Hołownia to be number 2. So if you want to phrase it like that, in case Rafał Trzaskowski doesn't make it on Sunday and Andrzej Duda remains our president, which I don't hope will happen, but this is a pretty likely result. If this happens, you can theoretically blame those 1.6 million who were not courageous enough to step outside their comfort zone and to give us all hope and give us all a new beginning, a new chapter, a new opening. And this would have been very important because Szymon Hołownia, by all accounts and by all surveys, by all polls, had the highest chance, the highest likelihood of actually winning against Andrzej Duda in the second round. But unfortunately, this didn't happen. So obviously, there are many questions around, okay, what's going to happen to the thousands of volunteers and the millions of supporters that Szymon Hołownia was able to convince during this presidential campaign. Szymon Hołownia very quickly announced that this movement, which currently was, or until now was more or less informal, will be transformed into an official association. And the association will be called Polska 2050 or Poland 2050. Why this name? Because one of the key themes of Szymon Hołownia's campaign was that future policies need to be aligned with the needs of an entire generation, rather than only be crafted and designed to win the next election, to prolong one's hold, one's grip on power. Instead of worrying about winning the next election, politicians, he says, should worry about the challenges that are ahead of our nation and ahead of our country, and make those decisions which are likely to create the best outcomes over decades. Right? So one of his key messages was create policies, implement policies that are valuable and dependable and beneficial for the nation over decades. And 2050 is a good benchmark or a good year to be taken as a target. A lot of studies that look, for instance, at demographics, the climate crisis, they are talking about developments until 2050. So Poland 2050 is meant to underline that we are here for the long run, that we want sustainable solutions, and we want solutions that will be working for generations, not only for a few years or terms in office. Now, all the current offices, speaking of offices, that have been created in various cities across the country will be serving as a way of, or as a form of embassy, representing the Poland, giving a sneak peek at the Poland that we would like to create once we will have more influence on the day-to-day politics in Poland. The movement itself will not embrace anyone from the two candidates. Szymon Hołownia said that he doesn't have, his dream candidate in the second round. That yet again, like in the many years before, he is forced to choose the lesser evil. He did everything he could, also with the movement, to change that, to and this 15 years of choosing the lesser evil, but unfortunately this time around it didn't work out. Still, he encourages everyone, regardless of what your personal preference is in terms of who you would like to vote for, to go and participate in the elections, because voter participation is very important, and we need to take advantage of all the democratic means that are still at our disposal. So I would definitely also encourage everyone to participate in Sunday's elections, no matter who you would like to vote for. So again, everyone is encouraged, highly encouraged to participate in the elections, but there's no official statement from the movement around who to support. Szymon Hołownia also said that he himself doesn't want another 5 years of Andrzej Duda, so he will vote against Andrzej Duda staying in office as the Polish president. Now, he also talked about Rafał Trzaskowski, and he said that Rafał Trzaskowski actually contacted the association, or rather contacted, since the association is still in the process of being created, he contacted the office of Szymon Hołownia and asked for a dialogue around what are the important positions of Szymon Hołownia's movement and the expectations for the presidency. And so Szymon Hołownia and his movement actually came up with 4 major requirements that a future Polish president should meet in order to really show that he is independent from party influence. Many of them, by the way, are driven directly by the political agenda that Szymon Hołownia was running on during his presidential campaign. First of all, 3 main reasons to veto a bill. If a bill hasn't passed all the requirements of the regular democratic procedures, it should be vetoed. The same should be true if a bill makes it harder for Poland to become carbon neutral by 2050, or any other bill that would be against sustainable politics when it comes to the environment. And lastly, the next president should also veto all bills that would take away responsibilities from the self-government, or that would add responsibilities without clearly describing and defining additional sources of income for local governments in order to fund those additional tasks that they are meant to carry out. The second requirement was around nominations. So who should be part of the future staff that the president would be working with. And here 4 positions were mentioned specifically. It was the chief of the chancellery, so the chief of the presidential office, the minister for legal affairs, the foreign minister, and the chief of the National Bureau of Security, National Security Bureau. Those 4 positions should be nominated and taken by people who have never been members of a political party. The third one is a request to the Supreme Audit Bureau to carry out an audit among public institutions and publicly held enterprises around how members of the board, for instance, or members of the leadership, or high-level officials have been nominated, whether the nomination was based on party membership or whether it was merit-based. And the fourth one was to create a self-government council so that presidents and mayors representatives of counties, of cities, of villages could join into an advisory body that could be consulted by the president on any issues and legislative initiatives that would be related to the local government. Now, I think those requirements make a lot of sense, and in the comments actually you will find how Rafał Trzaskowski responded to those requests, what his opinion was. It looks like he has embraced all four. Now, it's in everyone's guess how many of them would actually be realized, would actually get implemented if Rafał Trzaskowski was to become the next president of Poland. What are his chances of doing so, or actually winning the election? According to the polls, it will be a very tight race. At the moment, it all depends on how many of the voters who didn't vote for Rafał Trzaskowski actually will participate in the election. So participation will be key. The ones who supported Andrzej Duda are almost certain to go and vote for him again. The same is likely true for those who have already voted for Rafał Trzaskowski in the first round. But the big question is how many of the other supporters will simply stay at home because their favorite candidate didn't make it into the second round. And this is very hard to predict. The latest polls seem to indicate that nobody has a lead which will be greater than the margin of error. However, remember that in the past, most of the polls have underestimated the support for the Peace Party or the support for their candidates for the office of president. So at this point, it looks most likely like Andrzej Duda will make it and will stay in office until after the second round of the presidential elections. Stay tuned. We will definitely cover this event. Of course, it's one of the most important political events for the next few years in Poland. It will decide whether we will have earlier parliamentary elections, where the parliament will be dissolved. It will also decide about the future, or it will determine the future of the civic platform. Because if the civic platform continues to lose against peace, it will most likely fall apart and be replaced by other pro-democratic center and center-right movements. So it's definitely a result that will be watched very closely, not only in Poland, but at least around Europe, probably around the world. And I definitely invite you to stay tuned to our coverage, which we hope to bring to you as soon as possible once it becomes clear who has actually won the elections. Because on Saturday evening, it's entirely possible that the results will be so close that they will, both of them will remain within the margin of error, and we will not be able to declare a clear winner. Thanks so much for your attention. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below, leave them in the comment section, and I'm sure to come back to you as fast as possible. Stay tuned. Please go and vote if you have the right to vote on Sunday, and see you next time.